My son said my grandmother's jewelry was fake, worthless costume pieces and threw them in the garbage. What he didn't know was that he'd just tossed a 1920s Art Deco collection worth $340,000, and I was about to teach him the difference between costume jewelry and museum quality antiques. The morning that changed everything started with what my son Robert called an intervention about reality. I was in my Louisville kitchen, enjoying my usual Wednesday morning coffee and reading the newspaper, when I heard the sound of car doors slamming in my driveway. Through the window, I could see Robert getting out of his SUV with his wife Sandra and what looked like several boxes and cleaning supplies. Before I could even get to the front door, Robert was letting himself in with his spare key, followed by Sandra carrying what appeared to be garbage bags and storage containers. "Morning, Julia," Robert said, his voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news they think is good news. "We're here to help you with the house situation." "What house situation?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I knew where this was heading. Sandra set down her supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd clearly planned this moment down to the last detail. "Julia, Robert and I have been talking, and we think it's time for you to start making some practical decisions about all the stuff you've been accumulating over the years." She gestured around my living room as if it were a warehouse rather than the home where I'd lived for 32 years, where I'd raised Robert after his father died, where every piece of furniture and every decorative object held memories that stretched back generations. "Accumulating," I repeated, looking around at what Sandra apparently saw as clutter, but what I knew to be a carefully curated collection of family heirlooms, books, art, and keepsakes that told the story of 4 generations of women. Robert shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with being the bearer of this particular message, but committed to seeing it through. "Mom, you're 79 years old. This house is getting to be too much for you to manage, and frankly, some of this stuff is just old." "Old?" I said quietly, watching as Sandra began opening storage containers as if my agreement to this process was a foregone conclusion. "Robert's right, Julia," Sandra said, pulling out what looked like appraisal forms and donation receipts. "We've been researching the best ways to help seniors transition to more manageable living situations, and the first step is always decluttering. Getting rid of items that no longer serve a purpose or have any real value." What happened next still makes my blood pressure rise when I think about it. Sandra had somehow decided that the logical place to start this decluttering process was with my jewelry collection, the pieces I kept in my grandmother's Art Deco jewelry box on my bedroom dresser. "For instance," she said, returning from my bedroom with the lacquered black and silver box that had belonged to my grandmother Evelyn, "this jewelry situation is exactly what we're talking about." She set the box down on my kitchen table and opened it with the casual disregard of someone handling what she'd already determined was worthless. Inside were the pieces I'd inherited from my grandmother when she died in 1962. Necklaces, bracelets, brooches, and earrings that had been her pride and joy during the 1920s and 1930s. "Look at this stuff, Julia," Sandra said, lifting out a stunning Art Deco emerald and diamond necklace that had been my grandmother's favorite piece. "These are obviously costume jewelry, probably bought at department stores or from catalogs. Nobody back then could afford real gems, especially not during the Depression." Robert nodded along, clearly relieved that his wife was taking the lead on this conversation. "Mom, I know you're attached to these pieces because they belong to Grandma Evelyn, but you have to be realistic. These are novelty items, not valuable jewelry." Sandra was now sorting through the pieces with the clinical efficiency of someone appraising livestock. The intricate platinum and diamond bracelet that my grandmother had worn to her wedding was dismissed as probably silver-plated base metal. The elaborate sapphire and diamond brooch that had been a gift from my grandfather was labeled colored glass stones in a cheap setting. "The thing is," Sandra continued, clearly warming to her subject, Keeping all this fake jewelry around is actually kind of sad. It's like you're trying to pretend you have valuable assets when what you actually have are costume pieces that were designed to look expensive without actually being worth anything. What Sandra did next still haunts me. Without asking my permission or even pausing to consider that these pieces might have sentimental value, regardless of their monetary worth, she began dropping my grandmother's jewelry into a large black garbage bag. "The best thing we can do," she announced, "is just get rid of this stuff entirely. It's not worth donating. Who wants used costume jewelry from 90 years ago? And trying to sell it would be embarrassing for everyone involved." "Wait," I said, reaching toward the bag. "You can't just throw away my grandmother's jewelry." Robert gently but firmly took my arm. "Mom, Sandra's right. These aren't family heirlooms. They're costume pieces that have no value beyond the memories attached to them. And memories don't require keeping the physical objects." "We can take photos if you want," Sandra added helpfully, as if photographing my grandmother's jewelry before throwing it in the garbage was some kind of compromise. "That way you can remember the pieces without having to store them." I watched in growing horror as piece after piece of my grandmother's collection disappeared into that black bag. The delicate pearl and diamond earrings she'd worn to my baptism, the ornate gold and ruby ring that had belonged to her mother, the spectacular Art Deco necklace and bracelet set that she'd told me had been made by the finest jewelers in New York. "This is insane," I said, but my protests were falling on deaf ears. "Julia, I know this is emotional," Sandra said in the patronizing tone people use when they think they're being patient with someone who's being unreasonable. "But sometimes we have to make tough decisions. Keeping boxes full of worthless costume jewelry isn't healthy or practical." Robert was already tying up the garbage bag, clearly eager to get this unpleasant task behind him. "Mom, once this stuff is gone, you'll feel so much lighter. You won't have to worry about organizing it or cleaning it or finding space for it. It's liberating." "Liberating," I repeated, watching 30 years of my grandmother's carefully chosen and lovingly maintained jewelry collection disappear into a trash bag. But Sandra wasn't finished. Apparently, she'd done extensive research on this process because she pulled out her phone and called someone she referred to as the expert. "I've arranged for Janet Morrison to come take a look at the rest of your things," she announced. "She's an estate sale professional who specializes in helping families identify what's actually valuable versus what's just taking up space." Janet arrived within an hour, a brisk woman in her 50s who walked through my house with the confidence of someone who'd seen thousands of similar situations. She examined my furniture, my art collection, my china, and my books with the clinical detachment of a coroner performing an autopsy. "The good news," Janet announced after her survey, "is that most of this can be easily disposed of. The furniture is mid-century modern. There's a small market for that, but nothing significant. The books are mostly common editions with no collectible value. The china is nice, but not particularly rare or valuable." She paused in front of the empty jewelry box on my kitchen table. "I see you've already dealt with the costume jewelry situation. That's smart. Most people struggle with throwing away fake pieces because they look fancy, but they're really just mass-produced novelties." Sandra nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly what we told Julia. These old costume pieces were just taking up space and serving no purpose." "Absolutely right," Janet confirmed. "I see this all the time with families cleaning out older relatives' belongings. People hold on to costume jewelry thinking it might be valuable, but unless you're talking about signed designer pieces from major fashion houses, and even then only certain pieces from certain eras, it's all essentially worthless." Robert looked vindicated by Janet's professional opinion. "See, Mom, we're not being heartless. We're being practical." What none of them knew, what they'd never bothered to ask about, was the true story of my grandmother's jewelry collection and how she'd acquired those pieces. My grandmother, Evelyn Bergman, hadn't been some ordinary housewife buying costume jewelry from department store catalogs. She had been the daughter of Samuel Rosen, one of Louisville's most successful jewelry importers during the 1910s and 1920s. Her father's business, Rosen Fine Jewelry, had catered to the city's wealthiest families, and Evelyn had grown up surrounded by genuine precious stones and expert craftsmanship. When she married my grandfather in 1923, her father had given her a collection of jewelry that represented the finest examples of Art Deco design available at the time. These weren't purchases made by a young woman trying to look fashionable. They were investments selected by a man who understood the jewelry business better than anyone else in Kentucky. The emerald and diamond necklace that Sandra had dismissed as probably colored glass was actually a documented Cartier piece purchased directly from their New York showroom in 1924. The sapphire and diamond brooch was signed by Van Cleef Arpels. The platinum and diamond bracelet was a Tiffany Co creation from their most prestigious Art Deco line. But I'd never shared this information with Robert or Sandra. My grandmother had taught me that true wealth was something you kept private, something you didn't flaunt or discuss casually. She'd told me stories about the provenance of each piece, but she'd also taught me that their real value lay not in their price tags, but in the love and care with which they'd been chosen and preserved. I'd planned to have the collection properly appraised at some point to create documentation for insurance purposes and to ensure that future generations would understand what they were inheriting. But I'd never gotten around to it, and now those plans seemed irrelevant since the entire collection was sitting in a garbage bag destined for a landfill. That evening, after Robert and Sandra left and my house felt empty and violated, I sat at my computer and began researching something I should have investigated years earlier. I started with the names I remembered my grandmother mentioning: Cartier, Van Cleef Arpels, Tiffany Co., and began looking up examples of 1920s Art Deco jewelry from these designers. What I found made my hands shake as I scrolled through auction results and collector websites. Pieces similar to what had been in my grandmother's collection were selling for tens of thousands of dollars. Some examples were going for six figures. A Cartier Art Deco emerald and diamond necklace, similar to the one Sandra had thrown away, had sold at Christie's the previous year for $85,000. I called the first number I found for a certified jewelry appraiser in Louisville. Even though it was after business hours, I left a detailed voicemail describing what had happened and asking for advice about how to proceed. The appraiser, Dr. Margaret Chen, called me back within 2 hours. "Mrs. Bergman," she said after I'd explained the situation, "please tell me you've retrieved those pieces from wherever they were discarded." "They're in garbage bags in my garage," I said. "I rescued them from the curb after my family left." "Thank God," she said with obvious relief. "Based on what you're describing, 1920s pieces from a collection assembled by a professional jewelry importer, you could be looking at a very significant collection. Art Deco jewelry from major designers is one of the hottest areas in the auction market right now." She arranged to come to my house the following morning for a preliminary assessment. Dr. Chen arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, carrying a collection of magnifying equipment, reference books, and documentation that made Janet Morrison's estate sale clipboard look like a child's toy. She spent 4 hours examining each piece in my grandmother's collection, using specialized tools to test metals, examine settings, and identify maker's marks that were invisible to the naked eye. "Mrs. Bergman," she said finally, setting down her magnifying glass, "what you have here is not costume jewelry. This is a museum-quality collection of Art Deco pieces from some of the most prestigious jewelry houses in the world." She showed me the tiny signatures and maker's marks she'd found on each piece: the Cartier signature on the emerald necklace, the Van Cleef Arpels mark on the sapphire brooch, the Tiffany Co stamp on the platinum bracelet. "This necklace alone," she said, indicating the piece Sandra had called colored glass in a cheap setting, "is worth between $90,000 and $120,000. It's a documented 1924 Cartier Art Deco design, and the emeralds are natural Colombian stones of exceptional quality. I nearly fell off my chair. $90,000 for one necklace? At minimum, she confirmed. The Art Deco market has exploded in recent years. Collectors are paying premium prices for documented pieces from this era, especially when they come with provenance and have been properly maintained. She continued through the collection piece by piece. The Van Cleef and Arpels brooch, $45,000 to $60,000. The Tiffany bracelet, $35,000 to $50,000. Even the smaller pieces, the earrings, rings, and pins that Sandra had dismissed as novelty items, were worth thousands of dollars each. The total collection, Dr. Chen said finally, assuming everything is in the condition it appears to be, is worth approximately $340,000, possibly more if you consign the pieces to a major auction house where collectors will compete for them. Armed with Dr. Chen's professional appraisal and detailed documentation of each piece, I called Robert and asked him and Sandra to come over that evening. I didn't tell them why, just that it was important and related to the jewelry they'd thrown away. They arrived looking slightly guilty, probably assuming I was going to lecture them about sentimental value and family memories. Sandra was carrying what looked like more storage containers, apparently ready to continue the decluttering process. Julia, if this is about the jewelry, I want you to know that we understand it was emotionally difficult, Sandra said before I could even speak. But sometimes we have to make tough decisions about keeping things that don't have actual value. Sit down, I said quietly, pointing to my kitchen table where I'd spread out Dr. Chen's appraisal documents, authentication certificates, and auction comparisons. Before we talk about value, I continued, I want to show you something about those worthless costume pieces you threw in the garbage. I handed them Dr. Chen's official appraisal report. Sandra read it first, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something approaching panic. This says, she started, then stopped, reading it again. It says that the fake emerald necklace you threw away is actually a 1924 Cartier piece worth between $90,000 and $120,000, I said calmly. Robert took the papers from Sandra, scanning through them with growing alarm. Mom, this can't be right. These numbers, this says the whole collection is worth over $300,000. $340,000 to be precise, I corrected. The cheap costume jewelry you convinced me to throw away is actually one of the finest collections of Art Deco designer pieces that Dr. Chen has ever seen. Sandra was staring at the authentication certificates like they might bite her. But how is that possible? Your grandmother was just a regular housewife. How could she have afforded jewelry like this? My grandmother was the daughter of Samuel Rosen, who owned the most prestigious jewelry importing business in Louisville, I explained. These pieces weren't bought by someone trying to look wealthy. They were selected by someone who actually was wealthy and who understood quality better than anyone else in the state. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced with my family. Robert was calculating numbers in his head, his face growing paler with each mental addition. Sandra was reading through the documentation with the expression of someone trying to wake up from a nightmare. $340,000, Robert said finally. Mom, that's more than my annual salary for the next 8 years. It's more than our house is worth, Sandra added, her voice barely above a whisper. And you threw it in the garbage, I said quietly, because you assumed that old meant worthless, and that your opinion was more valuable than actual expertise. What followed was the most humbling conversation I'd ever had with my daughter-in-law. Sandra, who had been so confident about identifying fake jewelry just 24 hours earlier, was now asking detailed questions about authentication, provenance, and proper care of valuable pieces. Mrs. Bergman, she said formally, having apparently lost the right to call me Julia, I owe you the most sincere apology of my life. I almost convinced you to throw away a fortune because I was too arrogant to consider that I might not know what I was looking at. Robert was holding the Cartier necklace now, examining it with the reverence of someone handling a religious artifact. Mom, I feel sick. I literally put this in a trash bag and was going to leave it on the curb for garbage pickup. The question now, I said, is what we've all learned from this experience. Over the following weeks, my relationship with Robert and Sandra underwent a complete transformation. They began visiting regularly, not to help me declutter, but to learn about the history and significance of the pieces they'd almost destroyed. Sandra started researching Art Deco jewelry with the same intensity she'd once applied to estate sale disposal. I want to understand everything, she told me one afternoon as we were carefully cleaning the Cartier necklace. I want to learn about jewelry design and precious stones and craftsmanship so I never make a mistake like this again. The most important thing to understand, I said, watching her handle the emeralds with newfound respect, is that value isn't always obvious. Sometimes the most precious things are the ones that look ordinary until you take the time to really understand them. 2 months later, I had the entire collection professionally photographed and documented for insurance purposes. The final appraisal came in at $340,000, exactly as Dr. Chen had predicted. But more importantly, I'd gained something that was worth far more than money: the knowledge that my family finally understood the difference between assumptions and expertise, between quick judgments and careful evaluation. My son had said my grandmother's jewelry was fake, worthless costume pieces and threw them in the garbage. What he discovered was that he'd just tossed a 1920s Art Deco collection worth $340,000, and the lesson about respect, research, and the hidden value of family heritage was priceless. Sometimes the most valuable education comes from nearly losing something irreplaceable.